Do you remember the Giants? The Titans who walked the earth in the 1980s. Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant, Macho Man Randy Savage. These weren't just wrestlers. They were superheroes. They were larger than life. Their battles felt like epic poems in a squared circle. Every Saturday morning, millions of us were glued to TV. We watched Hogan tell us to train, say our prayers, and eat our vitamins. We saw the bright colors, the larger-than-life personalities, and the simple, powerful stories of good versus evil. It was a golden age. The World Wrestling Federation, the WWF, was a marketing machine. It sold out arenas from Madison Square Garden to the Los Angeles Forum. It created merchandise that flew off the shelves: lunchboxes, action figures, t-shirts, video games. Wrestling was everywhere. It felt like this empire would last forever. But by the early 1990s, the shine began to fade. The heroes of yesterday were getting older. The simple stories of good versus evil started to feel repetitive, a little stale. The audience that had grown up with Hulkamania was now entering its teenage years, and its tastes were changing. The world was changing. Grunge music was taking over the radio with its angst and realism. Grittier, more complex movies and television shows were becoming popular. The cartoonish black and white morality of 1980s wrestling felt like a relic. The Titans began to leave the mountain. Hulk Hogan departed for Hollywood, then, shockingly, for the competition in World Championship Wrestling, WCW. Randy Savage followed him. Other main event stars faded away or left the business. The WWF tried to create new heroes. They pushed Lex Luger as the next great American patriot. They put the title on the massive Diesel. But the magic wasn't quite there. The connection felt forced. The audience could tell they were being sold a replacement, not the real thing. The foundation of the wrestling empire was cracking. The once deafening roar of the crowd was slowly quieting to a murmur. Something was wrong. Then came 1995. This was the year the cracks in the foundation became gaping chasms. If the early 1990s were a slow decline, 1995 was a freefall. The business wasn't just struggling, it was on life support. Attendance at live events plummeted. Television ratings hit historic lows. The big pay-per-view events, once a license to print money, were now struggling to attract buyers. It felt like the entire industry was shrinking, curling in on itself. The vibrant colors of the 80s had been replaced by a drab, uninspired palette. The energy was gone. The spectacle felt small. For fans who remembered the glory days, it was a painful thing to watch. The WWF, the industry leader, was in a desperate state. To save money, they were running shows in smaller venues, like high school gymnasiums. Their top stars were no longer household names. Their creative direction was a mess of bizarre, cartoonish gimmicks. They had a wrestling plumber named T.L. Hopper, a wrestling dentist named Isaac Yankem, DDS, a man who thought he was a swashbuckling pirate named Jean-Pierre Lafitte. It was a creative nightmare. It felt like the company was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something, anything, would stick. But nothing did. It only alienated the remaining audience even further, making the product feel like a parody of its former self. Meanwhile, their main competitor, WCW, wasn't much better. While they had the big names from the past, like Hogan and Savage, their presentation was just as dated. Their flagship show, Monday Nitro, wouldn't debut until the fall. For most of the year, they were stuck in a creative rut, producing a show that felt old and out of touch. And down in Philadelphia, a small, violent, and rebellious promotion called Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW, was making noise. But it was a niche product, too bloody and chaotic for a mainstream audience. The entire landscape of professional wrestling in 1995 was bleak. It looked like the end. This is the story of that year. The year wrestling almost died. The year the magic seemed to vanish for good. But it's also the story of what happened in the shadows. It's about the quiet experiments, the desperate gambles, and the risky decisions made when all hope seemed lost. Hidden beneath the terrible gimmicks and the empty seats, something new was beginning to grow. This is the story of how a near collapse became the unlikely turning point for the entire industry. So, how did the worst year in wrestling history secretly plant the seeds for its biggest boom? How did rock bottom become the foundation for a rebirth? The problems of 1995 didn't just appear out of thin air. They were the rotten fruit of a tree planted years earlier. The ground was poisoned by the federal steroid scandal that rocked the WWF in the early 1990s. Vince McMahon, the architect of the 80s boom, was put on trial. He was accused of conspiring to distribute steroids to his performers. The trial cast a long, dark shadow over the entire business. It peeled back the curtain and exposed the underbelly of the superhero fantasy. These larger-than-life heroes, it turned out, might have had some chemical assistance. The scandal shattered the family-friendly image the WWF had meticulously built. It was a public relations nightmare that never truly went away. Though McMahon was eventually acquitted in 1994, the damage was done. The trial was a costly distraction financially and creatively. It forced the company to change its entire philosophy. The impossibly muscled physiques that had defined the main event scene were suddenly a liability. The WWF began drug testing its talent rigorously. This led to a dramatic visual change in the product. Wrestlers appeared smaller, less like comic book characters, more like ordinary athletes. While this was a responsible move, it inadvertently broke the visual contract with the audience. The land of the giants was suddenly populated by men of average size, and the spectacle suffered for it. The financial fallout was just as severe. The legal fees were enormous. The bigger cost was the loss of public trust. The bigger cost was the loss of sponsor confidence. Companies that had once eagerly lined up to attach their brands to the WWF's red, white, and blue heroism now kept their distance. The business became toxic in the eyes of corporate America. This financial squeeze meant less money for production, less money for talent, less money for marketing. The grand spectacle of WrestleMania began to feel less grand. The weekly television shows looked cheaper. The entire operation was forced to downsize, a humiliating retreat for an empire that had once seemed invincible. This era of austerity directly fed the creative crisis of 1995. With a smaller talent pool and a mandate to move away from the bodybuilder look, the company scrambled for new ideas. The focus shifted from powerful heavyweights to smaller, more athletic performers. But the creative team seemed unsure how to present them. Hulk Hogan, the monster. The old formula of Hulk Hogan versus the monster no longer worked when the hero was a regular-sized guy. The scandal forced the WWF to change, but it offered no clear path forward. It left them wandering in a creative desert, haunted by the ghosts of their past success, shackled by the consequences of their past mistakes. In the wake of the steroid trial, the WWF doubled down on a misguided creative direction. If they couldn't have real-life superheroes, they would create literal cartoon characters. If wrestlers weren't physically imposing, their personalities needed to be even more outlandish. This led to the infamous New Generation era, an era defined not by great wrestling, but by an endless parade of absurd occupation-based gimmicks. This was the period that gave us characters that are now legendary for all the wrong reasons. Duke the Dumpster Droz, a wrestling garbage man who carried a trash can to the ring. Mantor, a man in a giant fuzzy bull's head who would charge and moo at opponents. Dr. Isaac Yankem, an evil dentist introduced as Jerry Lawler's private practitioner. These weren't compelling antagonists. They were bad jokes that had long overstayed their welcome. Each new character felt more ridiculous than the last, turning the flagship wrestling program into a sad, weekly laughingstock. The problem was that these gimmicks were a dead end. There was no room for character development. How does a wrestling plumber evolve? What is the long-term story for an evil dentist? The one-note nature of these personas meant that feuds were shallow and nonsensical. The matches themselves were often an afterthought, secondary to the silliness of the gimmick. This creative bankruptcy drove away the loyal, longtime fans who remembered the epic storytelling of the past. They had traded the compelling drama of Savage versus Steamboat for the absurdity of a dentist fighting a garbage man. It was a profound betrayal of what had made wrestling great. This approach also wasted a roster of genuinely talented performers. Glenn Jacobs played Isaac Yanko. He would later become Kane, one of the most iconic characters of the Attitude Era. Jean-Pierre Lafitte, the pirate gimmick, was actually Carl Ouellet, a phenomenal athlete. But in 1995, their skills were buried under creative nonsense. The WWF had a roster of capable wrestlers, but they were trapped in a creative graveyard. They were forced to play clowns when they wanted to be gladiators, and the audience could feel their frustration. At the center of this crumbling WWF empire was a new champion, Diesel. Kevin Nash, the man behind the character, was a 7-foot-tall performer, charismatic, with a cool, modern look. He was everything Vince McMahon wanted in a post-Hogan flagship star. After a hugely popular run as a rebellious anti-hero, the WWF decided to put the rocket on his back. In late 1994, he won the WWF Championship in a matter of seconds. The company believed they had found their new savior. But Diesel's championship reign in 1995 was a commercial disaster. It wasn't entirely his fault. He was booked as a smiling, corporate-friendly babyface, a role that stripped him of his rebellious edge. He became a generic good guy, a bland imitation of Hulk Hogan. The audience didn't want another Hogan. They wanted the cool, tough Diesel they had cheered for before. The company misunderstood his appeal and killed what made him special. He was a king, but he ruled a rapidly shrinking kingdom. The numbers tell the story. House show attendance, television ratings, pay-per-view buy rates, all hit rock bottom. King of the Ring and SummerSlam posted some of the worst business figures. He was headlining half-empty arenas. The WWF was losing money, and the man at the top took the blame. The experiment had failed. The Chosen One was not leading them out of the darkness. He was presiding over the darkest period the company had known. The pressure on him must have been immense. You could no longer just anoint a king and expect the people to follow. The failure exposed a deeper problem. The WWF no longer knew how to create a star. They had an 80s formula, but the world had changed. They tried to plug a new person into an old system, and it didn't compute. The audience of 1995 was more cynical and media savvy. They could see the corporate machinery, and they rejected the manufactured hero. Diesel's reign was a painful, year-long lesson. It proved the old ways were dead. While the WWF was in a creative and financial freefall, its main competitor, World Championship Wrestling, should have been thriving. On paper, WCW had everything going for it. They were backed by the deep pockets of media mogul Ted Turner. They had a national television slot on his network, TNT. And they had the biggest star in the history of the business, Hulk Hogan. After Hogan left the WWF, he signed with WCW in 1994, bringing his iconic Hulkamania persona with him. It was a massive coup for the Atlanta-based promotion. They had the ultimate weapon, the man who had built the WWF into an empire. Victory seemed assured. But for most of 1995, WCW was a disorganized mess. They had Hogan, but they didn't know what to do with him beyond recycling his greatest hits from the 80s. The creative direction was stale and repetitive. Hogan, still clad in his classic red and yellow, would battle a series of cartoonish monsters in a faction called the Dungeon of Doom. This group included characters like the Shark, the Zodiac, and a massive, clumsy giant called the Yeti, who looked like a mummy wrapped in toilet paper. It was a bizarre and childish feud that felt hopelessly out of date. It was the WWF's 80s formula, but 5 years too late and with none of the original magic. The audience's reaction was lukewarm at best. While Hogan's arrival had initially provided a boost, the novelty quickly wore off. Fans in the southern states, WCW's traditional stronghold, had always preferred a more realistic, athletic style of wrestling. They were used to the gritty rivalries of Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen. Hogan's cartoonish style and his parade of silly monster opponents were met with increasing indifference and, in some arenas, audible boos. The company was alienating its core audience in a misguided attempt to recapture the magic of a bygone era. They had the biggest name in wrestling, but they were using him in a way that actively hurt their brand. This creative stagnation created a deep sense of frustration within the company. Other talented performers on the roster, like Stunning Steve Austin, Cactus Jack, and the phenomenal Lord Steven Regal, were sidelined or ignored in favor of Hogan's aging friends and silly storylines. There was a clear ceiling for anyone who wasn't part of Hogan's inner circle. This created a toxic backstage environment and stifled the growth of new stars. WCW in early 1995 was a company with immense potential, but it was squandering its resources. It was stuck in the past, comfortable but complacent, and completely unaware of the revolution that was just around the corner. The collective failure of both major promotions created a power vacuum in the wrestling world. The throne of pop culture relevance, once firmly occupied by the WWF, was now empty. Wrestling was no longer part of the mainstream conversation. It had become a niche interest, a cultural afterthought. For kids who grew up in the 80s, wrestling was as big as Star Wars or Michael Jackson. But by 1995, it was deeply uncool. It was associated with bad jokes, childish characters, and aging stars who refused to let go of the past. The industry had lost its cultural currency, and there was nothing on the horizon that seemed capable of getting it back. This decline was reflected in every metric. Television ratings were dismal. Merchandise sales had dried up to a trickle. Major toy lines were discontinued. Video game sales slumped. The ancillary businesses that fed off wrestling's popularity were all suffering. It seemed as though the American public had simply moved on. Wrestling had been a fad, like pogs or slap bracelets, and its time was over. The party had ended, and almost everyone had gone home. This created a profound sense of despair within the business. Wrestlers who had once performed in front of 80,000 people at WrestleMania were now working in small, half-empty halls for a fraction of the pay. The glamour was gone. For many, it was just a job, and a poorly paying one at that. Many talented performers left the business altogether, seeking more stable careers. The pipeline of new talent seemed to be drying up. Why would any young, ambitious athlete want to enter a dying industry? It was a vicious cycle. The decline in popularity made it harder to attract new stars, and the lack of new stars made the product even less popular. This was the state of play in 1995. A once mighty entertainment empire reduced to rubble. Two rival promotions, both creatively bankrupt and failing to connect with an audience that had outgrown them. An empty throne with no apparent heir. From the outside, it looked like the end. It looked like professional wrestling was destined to fade away. But it is often in moments of total collapse that the most radical reinventions occur. When there is nothing left to lose, you become free to try anything. And in the dying embers of 1995, a few desperate people were about to start playing with fire. As the WWF floundered in a sea of cartoon characters and WCW recycled the past, one man decided the rules needed to change. That man was Eric Bischoff. He saw WWF's weakness as opportunity. Backed by the vast fortune of Ted Turner, Bischoff devised a bold plan. He wanted to take the fight to Vince McMahon. He wanted to go head-to-head. His weapon, a new primetime show on Turner's flagship network, TNT. It would air on Monday nights at the exact same time as WWF's Monday Night Raw. This was a declaration of war. It was risky, could fragment the audience. But Bischoff didn't care about tradition. He was brash, confident, from a sales background, not wrestling. He convinced Turner a live weekly show could win ratings. The show was named Monday Nitro. Debut, September 4th, 1995. a date that would change wrestling forever. Nitro was everything Raw was not. Raw was often pre-taped. Nitro would be live every week. That made it unpredictable. Anything can happen. Bischoff needed a shocking moment for the first episode. He secretly negotiated with Lex Luger. On September 4th, 1995, Nitro aired live from the Mall of America, Minnesota. The show felt different from the start. It was fast-paced, the lighting was darker, the action felt more immediate. Then, mid-match, the unthinkable happened. Lex Luger walked out into the middle of a WCW ring. The crowd was in genuine shock. The announcers were in genuine shock. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was a direct shot at the WWF, a public poaching. The war had begun. The first shot was a cannon blast that echoed across the industry. While the two giants were posturing for a corporate war, a third, much smaller revolution was brewing in a dingy bingo hall in South Philadelphia. This was the home of Extreme Championship Wrestling, ECW. Run by a visionary, almost maniacal promoter named Paul Heyman, ECW was the antithesis of the family-friendly, cartoonish product of the big companies. It was built on passion, violence, and rebellion against the mainstream. Heyman took a small regional territory and turned it into a cultural phenomenon. A punk rock wrestling show for disenfranchised fans, tired of being treated like children. ECW was a world away from colorful gimmicks and smiling heroes. The wrestlers were scarred, flawed, terrifyingly real. The Sandman, Sabu, a homicidal, suicidal, genocidal maniac. Terry Funk, a grizzled legend reborn amid barbed wire and broken tables. Storylines were dark, complex, deeply personal. Themes of betrayal, nihilism, and a desperate search for respect. Wrestling for adults, connecting on a visceral level. In 1995, ECW was a creative laboratory. No national TV pressure, no corporate sponsors, Heyman could experiment. He pushed the boundaries of wrestling storytelling. He blended styles. The product was diverse and constantly surprising. The Renegade promotion began to influence the wider business. Chants of ECW began to be heard in WWF and WCW arenas, a sign of audience discontent. ECW's raw energy made the mainstream look sterile. While Vince McMahon and Eric Bischoff were fighting over the past, Paul Heyman was building the future in a smoky bingo hall. He created a new language for wrestling, attitude and realism, that the big promotions would have to learn. Back in the WWF, Vince McMahon was now fighting a war on two fronts. He had WCW directly competing with him on Monday nights. And the spirit of ECW was infecting his audience. The old way of doing business was clearly failing. Desperation began to breed innovation. McMahon had built his empire on tightly controlled, family-friendly entertainment. He began to allow small cracks to appear in his pristine facade. He had no choice. Declining ratings and the launch of Nitro forced his hand. He had to make his show feel relevant again. He had to get edgier. One of the first signs was a character named Goldust. Debuting in late 1995, Goldust was unlike anything the WWF audience had seen. He was an androgynous, sexually ambiguous movie aficionado. He unnerved opponents with suggestive behavior. He would caress his own body. He would quote movie lines in a breathy whisper. He would play psychological mind games that were deeply uncomfortable. His feuds, particularly with Razor Ramon, were psychological and charged. In an era of cartoonish gimmicks, Goldust was complex, provocative, and unsettling. He was controversial. He generated complaints. For the first time in a long while, people were talking about a new WWF character. While Goldust represented a pivot in character complexity, another, perhaps more significant evolution was happening with one of the WWF's top good guys. Shawn Michaels, the Heartbreak Kid, had long been a cocky, arrogant villain. But his incredible in-ring performances made him impossible to boo. The audience recognized his immense talent and his undeniable charisma. In 1995, the WWF finally gave in and turned him into a babyface, a hero for the fans to cheer. But Michaels was not a hero in the mold of Hulk Hogan. He wasn't telling kids to eat their vitamins. He was brash, cocky, and carried himself with an arrogant swagger. He was the first true anti-hero of the era. This was a fundamental shift in how the WWF presented its top star. Michaels was still a good guy, but he was flawed. He was narcissistic, sometimes petulant, but his passion for performing and his incredible athleticism redeemed him. Fans, particularly the growing teenage and young adult demographic, connected with this. They didn't want a perfect, smiling superhero. They wanted someone cool, someone with an edge. They found that in Shawn Michaels. A key moment in this evolution occurred in the fall of 1995. In a storyline that blurred the lines between fiction and reality, Michaels was legitimately attacked outside a nightclub in Syracuse, New York. The WWF decided to incorporate this real-life event into their television show. They aired footage of a dazed and injured Michaels, and he later delivered an emotional, tearful promo where he had to forfeit his Intercontinental Championship. This was a level of realism the WWF had never shown before. It made Michaels seem vulnerable, human, and relatable. It shattered the cartoonish veneer and made his eventual comeback feel that much more triumphant. This blend of swagger and vulnerability was the magic formula. The Syracuse incident and the subsequent storyline were a major pivot away from kayfabe. By acknowledging a real-world event, the WWF was admitting that the audience was smart enough to know the difference. It was a sign of respect for their intelligence. Shawn Michaels' character became the prototype for the modern anti-hero that would come to define the Attitude Era. He was a hero you could cheer for, not because he was perfect, but because he was a phenomenal performer who wore his flaws and his heart on his sleeve. As the WWF and WCW began to experiment with edgier content, a new style of storytelling started to emerge, one that knowingly winked at the audience. The sacred wall between the performance and the reality behind it, known as the fourth wall, or kayfabe, began to develop cracks. Wrestlers started making comments that seemed to reference backstage politics or real-life personas. This was a radical departure from days when the business protected the illusion that everything was real. Now, promotions were using the audience's inside knowledge as a storytelling device, rewarding fans for their dedication. In WCW, this was most evident in the commentary booth. As part of the Monday Night War, Eric Bischoff instructed his announcers to give away the pre-taped results of WWF's Monday Night Raw, live on the air. This was a dirty, taboo tactic, but brutally effective. It made WCW Nitro feel like the only show that mattered. Over in the WWF, the blurring of lines was happening in the ring. A notable example: a feud between Shawn Michaels and Diesel. During matches, they used moves and taunts, inside jokes, and signals to each other, and to the hardcore fans who knew about their backstage friendship, the Click. This added realism and intrigue. It wasn't just characters fighting, it was a conflict between friends with real emotion under the choreography. It made the performance feel more authentic and compelling. Breaking the fourth wall was a response to the audience's growing sophistication. The internet was in its infancy, but dirt sheets and online forums were already pulling back the curtain on the business. Smart promoters leaned into it. They used the rumors and backstage gossip to fuel on-screen stories. This pivot was crucial. It transformed the show-audience relationship from a simple spectacle to a more interactive experience. Wrestling was no longer just a story. It became a story about the story, the complexity that won back a cynical audience. Perhaps the most significant and strangest pivot of 1995 involved Vince McMahon himself. For years, McMahon had been the friendly, slightly goofy announcer for his own product. The public at large had no idea that this familiar television personality was also the ruthless chairman and owner of the company. In 1995, that began to change. While he didn't yet become the villainous Mr. McMahon character, the seeds were planted. The line between his on-air and off-air roles started to dissolve. As an announcer, he would have to sell the terrible gimmicks. You could often hear a strain in his voice, a hint of real-life frustration. When he interviewed the rebellious Shawn Michaels or the controversial Goldust, there was palpable tension. It felt like a boss managing a difficult employee. The audience started to see him as an authority figure. This subtle shift was amplified by a new alliance on commentary. Vince began sharing the announce desk with Jerry, the King Lawler. Lawler openly mocked the good guys and celebrated rule breakers. This created a bizarre dynamic. Their bickering mirrored the company's internal conflict, the old family-friendly formula and a new, edgier direction. This unholy alliance was a quiet but radical pivot. It changed the tone of the broadcast. McMahon was allowing his own product to be criticized live on air. It was a strange, desperate, and brilliant move. It made the show feel more honest and self-aware. It was the first step toward creating the ultimate villain the company needed, Vince McMahon himself. The desperate experiments of 1995 were not isolated events. They were the first messy drafts of a new blueprint that would eventually build the most successful period in wrestling history, the Attitude Era. The DNA of that boom period can be found scattered throughout the failures and small victories of this pivotal year. The shift from one-dimensional cartoons to complex, flawed characters was the most crucial development. The anti-heroic swagger of Shawn Michaels and the provocative ambiguity of Goldust taught the WWF a vital lesson. They learned that the audience was ready for, and in fact craved, characters who operated in shades of gray. This new character philosophy was a direct rejection of the Hulkamania formula. It paved the way for a figure like Stone Cold Steve Austin. Austin's character, the beer-swilling anti-authoritarian rebel, was an evolution of the Shawn Michaels prototype. He was a good guy who was rude, violent, and did whatever he wanted. The audience of 1995 showed the WWF that they would cheer for a character based on charisma and authenticity, not on moral purity. Similarly, the willingness to embrace controversy, first tested with Goldust, became a core tenet of the Attitude Era. This lesson would be amplified tenfold with the formation of D-Generation X. They took the subtle innuendo of Goldust and made it loud, crude, and explicit. While 1995 was a commercial disaster, it was an incredibly important year for talent development. With the old guard of main event stars gone or fading, a new generation of performers was forced into the spotlight, ready or not. They were thrown into the deep end of a failing business and told to swim. This trial by fire forged some of the biggest stars the industry would ever see. In the WWF, two men who would come to define the Attitude Era were quietly cutting their teeth. Paul Levesque, then known as the blue blood snob Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Glenn Jacobs was trapped under the mask of the evil dentist Isaac Yankem. Both men were paying their dues. Their frustration and the lessons about what didn't work would directly inform their future personas, Triple H and Kane. 1995 was their grueling, unpaid internship for future superstardom. Meanwhile, in WCW, a frustrated, stunning Steve Austin was being criminally underutilized. He was fired in mid-1995 while injured. This act of disrespect lit a fire in Austin. He went to ECW, where Paul Heyman gave him a microphone to vent his real-life frustrations. There, he delivered scathing, passionate promos that became the foundation of the Stone Cold character. Another key figure, Mick Foley, was also paying his dues. As Cactus Jack, he was pushing the limits, proving that charisma and storytelling could be more important than a bodybuilder's physique. The most overlooked seed planted in 1995 was the change in the audience itself. The fans who stuck with wrestling through its worst year were a different breed. They were not the casual family audience of the 1980s, smaller, more dedicated, far more critical. They were the ones chanting ECW at WWF shows. They were the ones who were active on the early internet, discussing the backstage realities of the business. They were a smarter audience, and their vocal discontent was a major catalyst for change. The promotions had no choice but to start listening. The failure of the corporate-pushed hero Diesel and the organic rise of the cooler anti-hero Shawn Michaels was a perfect example of this new dynamic. This was a power shift. For the first time, the fans were not just passively consuming the product, they were actively shaping its direction. The launch of the Monday Night War further empowered this new, smart audience. By putting the two major promotions in direct competition, it turned watching wrestling into an interactive game. Fans were armed with remote controls. Flipping back and forth, comparing the products in real time, they became critics. This active engagement made them more invested. WCW and the WWF weren't just fighting for ratings, they were fighting for the loyalty and approval of this newly awakened fan base. This era gave birth to the modern fan culture we see today. The internet wrestling community exploded in popularity. The promotions, in turn, began to cater to this online buzz. The relationship became symbiotic. In the grand, sprawling narrative of professional wrestling, 1995 stands as a year of profound paradox. It was, by almost every conventional metric, the absolute worst of times. A commercial and creative abyss where a once mighty industry stared into the void of its own extinction. It was the year the magic died. Yet, as we have seen, this rock bottom was not an ending. It was a violent, necessary reset. The complete failure of the old formulas, the invincible superhero, the cartoon villain, the carefully protected illusion, forced the industry's hand. When your empire has already crumbled, you are no longer burdened by the pressure of protecting it. This desperation fostered a kind of freedom. It allowed for the messy, often accidental experiments. 1995 was a crucible, a brutal and unforgiving test that melted down the entire industry, separating the worthless dross from the precious metals that would be used to forge the future. The story of 1995 is therefore not one of failure, but of a painful and essential transformation. It is a testament to the idea that sometimes things must fall apart completely before they can be rebuilt into something stronger and more resonant. The seeds of the Attitude Era could never have been planted in the fertile, well-tended soil of the 1980s boom. They needed the cracked, desolate ground of 1995 to take root. It had to die to be reborn. The ultimate lesson of 1995 echoes far beyond the squared circle. It's a timeless story about resilience and the constant need for reinvention. The industry survived because, when faced with oblivion, it finally chose to listen to its audience. It stopped telling fans what they should like and started reflecting the world they actually lived in. More cynical, more media savvy, hungry for something with an edge. The modern landscape is a direct descendant of that year. The risks, then, going live, blurring reality and fiction, empowering new talent, created the grammar of modern wrestling. The spirit of 95 lives on whenever a performer gets a mic to speak their truth, whenever a storyline acknowledges the smart fan, whenever a promotion offers an alternative. So next time you watch a show, remember the ghosts of 95. Remember the garbage man, the dentist, the half-empty arenas. Don't see them as embarrassments. See them as necessary sacrifices at the altar of reinvention. They marked the moment the industry hit rock bottom, looked up, and began the climb back. The titans of the 80s built the empire, but the desperate, the flawed, and the forgotten of 95 quietly laid the foundation. They were the darkness before the boom.